Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending from where you are tuning in. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's lecture. We'll give everyone a second to file in. Let's see. All right, we can go ahead and get started. So good afternoon. Thank you all for being here for today's lecture, The Astonishing History of a Famous Monument in Alexandria, Egypt, with Dr. Paul Stanwyck. I'm Lisa Garadici, RC's US Director. So before we get started, I wanted to just share a few RC updates with you. I am so looking forward to seeing many of you next month for the 74th annual RC meeting, which will be held April 21st through the 23rd in Minneapolis. So registration is, of course, still open on our website, rc.org. And a reminder that the deadline to reserve the discounted room rate at the Marriott where we're hosting the conference is March 29th. So if you have registered but not booked your hotel room, we encourage you to do so you can get that discounted rate. And if you cannot join us in person, we are also hosting a virtual portion of the meeting, May 20th through 22nd. And if you are a registrant for the virtual meeting, you'll get the videos from the in-person lecture, and in-person registrants also get access to the virtual meeting. So we're doing our best to bring all of this wonderful information to all of you in as many avenues as possible. And a special note for anyone who is tuning in today from around our DMV, RC National is hosting a lecture with Dr. Frank Rulli, the Dean of Medical Faculty at the University of Zurich, for a special in-person lecture at the Lyceum here in Old Town Alexandria on April 13th. So if you're local, we'd love to have you join us that evening to hear his lecture, which is entitled Biomedical Secrets of Ancient Egyptian Mummies. And again, you can sign up on the website. So a quick reminder, please put all of your questions in the Q&A box, and we will answer the questions as time permits at the end. And now we turn our attention to today's lecture, and it is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Paul Stanwyck. So Dr. Stanwyck is a visiting scholar at New York University and the Institute of Fine Arts. He has lectured and written extensively on Egypt of the Greek and Roman periods. And Dr. Stanwyck serves as a member and the treasurer of the RC Board of Governors, and he works very hard on behalf of all of the RC membership, to which I can attest, and it's just been a joy to work with him and serve with him in that capacity. So today, Dr. Stanwyck will explore how and why Pompey's Pillar, more properly known as Diocletian's Column, has inspired storytellers, artists, and adventurers from Roman times to the present day. The enormous column is one of the few standing monuments preserved from ancient Alexandria in Egypt. It survived numerous regime changes and earthquakes from the time it was set up on a hill near the Mediterranean coast of Egypt. And after the destruction of Alexandria's famous ancient lighthouse, Pompey's Pillar endured as a symbol of Alexandria and a celebrated landmark for travelers arriving in the city by land and by sea. So please welcome Dr. Paul Stanwyck.
Thank you, Liska, for that wonderful introduction. I knew I would count on you for doing something wonderful like that. So thank you so much. So here we go, Pompey's Pillar through the ages. So this story, like so many, started during the pandemic when I was working on an article and I had decided that I would write something about Pompey's Pillar. And I had this idea that if I looked at a lot of older sources, in other words, pre-20th century, that I could find out some things about it that maybe could be interesting, particularly about the statue that's missing on top of the column. Now, that isn't exactly what I found out, unfortunately, but maybe fortunately, what I found instead was this whole array of stories and images that there are over the centuries. And they're interesting for themselves, but they're also interesting because they have all these themes that are relevant to things that we know about today, like what people believe versus science, and what can happen with images and they get manipulated digitally today, and also viral stories and how they, get momentum or sometimes fall. So let's start with some introductory stuff. So what is Pompey's Pillar? It is a rare standing monument of ancient Alexandria. It was put up at the time when Egypt was part of the Roman Empire. And you see on that map there of the ancient city, the pillar and the Serapeum in the southwest, and then a couple of other important monuments that we're going to be mentioning, Cleopatra's Needles, which are two obelisks that were in the ancient city. One is now in New York near the Metropolitan, the other one's in London. And then the Pharos Lighthouse, the famous monument. It was part of this ancient temple called the Serapeum, and you see a reconstruction view there with the column in the center of this rectangular colonnade made of many columns, and then the temple of Serapis towards the center. Serapis was an important deity in Roman Egypt. He was the patron of Egypt's inundation, the annual inundation, and this is when the Nile River would flood and bring all this rich soil onto the land that would then create this, wonderful harvest. It was very important for the wealth and the productivity of Egypt. It's made of 4 pieces of granite. There's a Greek inscription on the base where you see the number 3 there. There was originally a statue on the top, and for scale, you can see those people in the yellow circle, how big it is. It is more properly called Diocletian's column because that inscription in Greek on the column names Diocletian. And the theory is that it was a victory monument that commemorated the end of a civil war in 298. Some scholars speculate that it is a reused monument. In other words, that it was originally for some other earlier emperor. I'm not going to talk about that more today because I'm more concerned with the Diocletian and later history of the column. Here's something to show you just scale with it. So the 2 columns in Rome, Trajan's and Marcus Aurelius, are actually somewhat taller, but the difference is that those are made of drums of marble, whereas Diocletian's column, that whole shaft is 1 piece of granite. And then you see Cleopatra's Needle in New York also on the far left as a comparison. So why is it called Pompey's Pillar? Well, it got that name in part because the identity was lost for both the site and the pillar. So the ancient temple gets destroyed and that identity gets lost, and then the inscription on the column becomes difficult to read. And you can see that it's very high up, and granite is also a notoriously difficult stone on which to read inscriptions. So all this gets lost. So who was Pompey? So Pompey was this Roman general who was famously assassinated in Egypt. And there was this legend that there was an urn with his ashes atop the pillar. And this was a legend that persisted in Europe for over 500 years. And in a way, it's an accurate interpretation because Trajan's column, for example, was his tomb. And even though Diocletian's column did not function as a tomb, you could think that because other columns did function that way. Where did it come from? Well, this is not entirely certain, but it seems to in part focus on an interpretation of ancient sources. So this Roman poet Lucan says that Julius Caesar, the famous Julius Caesar, demanded that the Alexandrians in Egypt, this is after the assassination, he was very upset with that whole episode. He demanded that they gather his ashes into a single urn. And then this perhaps got mixed up later on in antiquarianism, where people were interested in the past in medieval and the Renaissance era, where legends were sort of mixed with historical facts. And this is an example of another one where the Vatican obelisk in Rome used to be topped with this urn, sort of type of urn for Julius Caesar's ashes. And this is just a legend. His ashes were not really in there. The other thing about this is that sometimes people associate the story with the Crusades, and this is when there were these Christian attempts to secure the Holy Land so that they would again be under the power of Rome. And interestingly, that's what happened under Pompey. That's when Jerusalem came under the power of ancient Rome, and it became a client kingdom of the Roman Empire. But there's nothing, this is a speculative idea because I don't know of any medieval or Renaissance source that makes this kind of a connection. Venice may also have something to do with this story because Venice has a long association with Alexandria. There were Venetian traders in Alexandria from the 9th century onwards, and then it was also a place where people departed from Europe to go to the Holy Land and also to Alexandria. More about this connection. So St. Marco's, which is St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, the intent, it was built originally because they wanted to have it take the place of the Martyrium, which held the relics of St. Mark in Alexandria. And St. Mark was this saint in the Christian faith who had preached in Alexandria and was martyred there for his faith. And so that Martyrium held his relics, and according to a legend, Venetians took those relics and brought them to St. Marco in Venice. St. Marco also therefore has these scenes of mosaics with scenes of Egypt. And that one that we're looking at there, which is the Holy Family traveling, you see the shape above the city gateway. And some scholars believe that this is the earliest European image we have of Pompey's Pillar. So if we look at it a little more closely, we do see a column, looks like a Corinthian column, very stylized, with an urn-like shape above it. And we could compare this to that map that we were seeing where much later, where it's kind of a round shape sitting, on top of the pillar. And obviously neither of these objects ever appeared on the top of the column. Why did it go viral? Well, importantly, with viral stories, they get promoted by powerful people. So this is what happened in this case. And here we have Petrarch with the earliest mention of this story. And he talks about it in his Holy Land guidebook that he wrote for a courtier. And then the other thing that happens a bit later is that we have the printing press invented. So then this story gets propagated in books. Now, it wasn't until the early 19th century when someone got on a ladder and looked at that inscription more carefully and then discovered that it was really for Diocletian. And there's the first publication in 1806. And then it took something like 50 years for this new naming to filter through sources. I mean, they didn't have the internet, obviously, back then. So, and indeed, by the time of the first Baedeker for Egypt in 1877, it does have the correct name, although, people still popularly call it Pompey's Pillar because of all the history of the column. So let's give a little historical background to help you with the rest of the talk. So in that early period up to 1000, so the pillar is inscribed for Diocletian. That's when we have the rise of Christianity and Islam. Egypt moves from part of the Roman Empire to be part of an Islamic caliphate. Then in the next 500-year period, we have the Crusades, we've got pilgrimage, we've got antiquarianism, which is, people being interested in the past, and then trade, particularly between Italy and the Islamic lands. And in the most recent period, we have global exploration, colonialism, science, and then, of course, modern archaeology and scholarship. In terms of the site itself, what happens is that there is a major destruction of the temple in 391, 392, which then leads to the descent into obscurity for the temple. Then Christian churches are built nearby, maybe with the floor of the 5th to the 7th centuries. And then still later, a mosque is established called the Mosques of the Masts. I don't know when it was established. I couldn't find any record of that, but there is a record of it being restored in 1475. Now, the interesting question to ask about this is to what extent the churches or the mosque somehow maybe reuse materials from the temple, even though they were not built over it. But the archaeology is such that we really can't answer this question. Now, the visual and written evidence starts out fairly limited in that first period, but then accelerates until the modern period where, there's an abundant amount of things, visual and written things about Pompey's Pillar. And you've got, mosaics, you've got travel accounts, scholarly publications, all sorts of things. The question is why? Why is there so much material? Well, one of the reasons, and I think this is by far the most important, is that it was a key landmark for centuries, and we'll talk more about that. It's also a power symbol. It was this must-see attraction for tourists, anyone visiting Egypt, and then, ultimately, scholarly interest. So the landmark, it was a landmark for sea and land. And the reason for this is not only that it was so tall, but it was also sitting on one of the highest land elevations in ancient Alexandria. And after the destruction of the lighthouse, which occurs by the 15th century, it is kind of the landmark that you could spot the harbor. And it became equated with the city almost as a symbol, like a hieroglyph. You would see the pillar and you would think, oh, Alexandria. And perhaps the reason that it survived, unlike so many other monuments of Alexandria, was because it in fact was useful. It was this landmark that was used extensively. So here's some of the written evidence about this that starts from the very beginnings of it and continues on into the modern era. This writer from the 4th century talking about it as a landmark. And then here we have Florence Nightingale, who's on this ship approaching Egypt, and she talks about how she saw Pompey's Pillar against the crimson clouds. Here it's on a navigational Ottoman Turkish map, and then we have it here on a European one where it's used as a sighting for a path in the harbor. And then finally, here's actually United States Navy publication, remarkably from 1920, which talks about it as the sailor's landmark. And there are many other references to this landmark status, which, for time, we can't look at today. Now, as a power symbol, that seems to start from the very beginning. As I mentioned before, the idea perhaps was that it commemorated a victory in a civil war. Later, it became a symbol of Christianity's victory over ancient religions. There's a trope in early Christianity that Christian saints would topple these statues from the top of pillars, sort of as a symbol of Christianity triumphing over ancient religions. And specifically in relationship to Pompey's Pillar, there's a story that St. Catherine, who's a legendary, not historical personage from ancient Alexandria, that she, through prayer, actually knocked the statue off the top of the pillar. And then finally, in the latest period, we have this copy of Pompey's Pillar that was created in Ireland to commemorate the British victory over France in Alexandria in 1801. And there's power by association. In the 19th century, it was a big sport to actually climb the column and stand on top of it. And when people did that, they would write inscriptions or their names in black paint on the pillar. Those have both obviously since been removed. And we have here a letter from Gustave Flaubert, who's a French novelist. He was witnessing this and, obviously didn't approve of it. And he talks about how this Thompson person wrote his name that you could see from like really far away. And that, basically what he was trying to do was, get eternity the way, the monument kind of had eternity. The other thing that happens is that the, purported fragments of the pillar become these popular tourist souvenirs, sort of take Pompey's Pillar home with you. Now, are these really fragments of the pillar? I would say not. I mean, the pillar is pretty intact, and I think these are much more likely to be just random fragments of granite that people either bought or maybe found somewhere, either near the pillar or, in Alexandria someplace. And here we have Mark Twain, the American writer, actually talking about this and how someone was with a hammer, this relic hunter was trying to hammer off unsuccessfully. He could not do it because granite is a really hard substance. Some kind of piece of Pompey's Pillar and some of the sphinxes, but he wasn't successful. And he, imagined that the Sphinx are kind of dismissing this person as, some poor insect that, no way is he could ever, take a piece of us. Must-see attraction. So we have all these adventurers and travelers who are interested in, Alexandria's past. So they develop all these ideas about the pillar. Here we have W.H. Smith from the 19th century, he had the theory that it was used to measure the Earth's meridian, and there he is kind of testing this out. He assumed that it was built much earlier than it actually was to come up with this idea. So let's look more about the written evidence. There's a long history of this from the 4th century to the present day, thousands of them, and then we have the archaeology of the site from the 19th through 21st centuries. And you're going to notice in this, there's this whole range of things between, science and belief systems, meaning, you have this firsthand observation and evidence-based stuff, which is like science and archaeology, versus these alternative ideas that are more based on authority, like religious beliefs and the supernatural and legends. So there's this whole mix of stuff which occurs in these stories. And the other thing can notice is that they are, wherever the story is, whatever their background, religion, culture, etc., that also influences what they say, and kind of as storytellers are influenced, today. So let's look at the names of the pillars. So we've been talking about it named as Pompey Pillar, which is, the dominant European name. But some other Europeans had other ideas about the naming. Some thought it was set up by Ptolemy, or maybe Alexander the Great, or maybe one of the other emperors. And you'll notice with all of these that they are connected with European imperial traditions. I mean, that's really the focus of what they're thinking about in the relationship to this column. Now, if you go to the Islamic traditions, in Arabic, it's called the column of the masts. And that's quite different. That instead emphasizes the height of it and the landmark status. So if you remember, as I was saying, the pillar was located amongst this, rectangular colonnade. So what one can imagine in the early Islamic period in Egypt in the first millennium, some of that colonnade, those surrounding pillars, were preserved. So you could envision someone seeing this huge column among many other smaller columns. So that's what this name seems to allude to, column among, many other columns, i.e. masts. In Ottoman Turkish, it's called the Stone of the Star. And I think this perhaps relate to the Islamic story that this was actual, you would stand on top and look at the stars, that it was an observatory. And if we look at this one illustration, Ottoman Turkish illustration of the pillar, it does look like there's a platform on top, maybe for this, purpose. Here are some of the travel accounts, Islamic ones. So we have here different ideas about what the ruins were about. The first one thought it was an ancient palace and that the pillar was a wonder of the world. And someone else talking about this idea of the astronomical observatory. And still another, in this case, a philosopher, someone who's a philosopher, thinking that he was standing in a school of philosophy where Aristotle taught. So these are all people who visited, the site, were eyewitnesses. Now, these obviously are not exactly what the ancient site was about, but they are interestingly related, strongly related to what it was, because the ancient temple was built by Roman emperors who visited there, and at least in one case, actually stayed there. I mean, it wasn't a palace, but there were accommodations there, apparently. And then it was also a place of learning, and it had a library, so you would imagine that there were philosophers, astronomers, and the like who were associated with the temple. So these Islamic stories seem to come out of all of that, and they are the ones that are closest to some of the ancient traditions. And then you also have these legends in Islamic traditions, like the ruins where this temple created by the jinn, which are these kind of magical genies. And they did it for Solomon, son of David, or the pillar was magic, or like if you closed your eyes and walked towards it, you would never actually reach it. Europeans, so with a variety of stories here, this Benjamin of Tudela, who's a Jewish merchant, he thought he was visiting an ancient school of philosophy, and maybe he picked up that story locally because that isn't something that seemed to have circulated that much in Europe. And then the Syriaca d'Ancona, he tried to read the inscription. He thought it said Alexander the Great. And then we have this pilgrim who thought he was, this was the site of Christian martyrdoms. And then finally, Clotzicard, who was the earliest person that I have found who actually correctly guesses that this was the ancient Serapeum. And then we also have legends on the European side, and I put quotes around it because they seem to mix sort of historical facts with, fantasy. And we have Bernard the Monk, this Frankish pilgrim who doesn't mention the pillar, but he talks about the Venetians taking the relics of St. Mark from Venice, from Alexandria to Venice. And then this Flemish pilgrim who talks about that legendary story about St. Catherine knocking the statue off the pillar. Then finally, we have a misinformationist, who's this, or I think he's a misinformationist, this Edward Wortley Montagu, who was an English traveler, excavator, and criminal. He was involved in extortion, bigamy, and other things. Now, he writes an account that he found a coin of Vespasian under the pillar and thus discovered who the pillar was really erected for. And you have to think at this time, so this is the 18th century, so this is before that inscription for Diocletian was rediscovered, so people were trying to figure, had alternative ideas about how to explain the pillar. And he wanted to be the one who became famous by discovering who it was. Well, somebody else tells the story that what really happened was that this guy himself secretly, when no one was looking, put the coin under the column so that he could find it when there were witnesses there, and thus launch his whole fame. So I will let you decide whose account you want to believe here. Pictorial traditions. So we have a whole range of mosaics, drawings, photography, etc. So we'll start with this mosaic from Caesarea Libya, which is a site in modern Libya to the west of Alexandria. And what you see are two panels there, the one on the left with these two statues atop structures. One of them is labeled Pharos, meaning probably the famous lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos. Other statue is not labeled. And then the other panel shows these sailors in ships who are looking at the statues and therefore navigating, presumably, to the harbor of Alexandria, by sighting those statues. So this is part of a larger floor mosaic, and it's immediately flanked by sea creatures, and then the rest of the mosaic shows sort of these earth and ocean scenes. Now, not all people agree on how to interpret this. I mean, the fact that it has Pharos, pretty much people would say, okay, that then means the Pharos of Alexandria, and that's the statue atop the Pharos lighthouse. Now, the other statue, number 2, I believe does represent the statue on Diocletian's column. And the reason that I think that is because of that really pervasive and long-lasting tradition of it being a landmark of the city. So I think if you're going to pick something other than the Pharos to show as a landmark, you're going to choose Diocletian's column, which next to the lighthouse was the landmark of the city. Here's another mosaic from Sepphoris, which is in modern Israel. And this one is in the midst of this whole scene of a generous inundation, which, as I mentioned before, was when the Nile would flood with all this rich soil so that you could have a wonderful harvest. In this case, there's a city gate to the left of the pillar there that is labeled Alexandria. So we know that at least parts of this are intended to evoke the city itself. Now, the column itself is not labeled, but the reason that I believe that this does represent or is intended to represent Diocletian's column is because it sat in the ancient Serapeum, which is the site that you had all these festivals associated with the inundations. So I think that then the column got associated with all that, and that's what you would want to show in a scene of celebration. Now, you say, well, but it's got these sort of stripes on it and the base doesn't match. We're going to talk more about why some of these representations don't do photographic type likenesses of the pillar. So what happened to the statue? From that account from Al-Masudi, which we were looking at before, he was the one who thought that the ruins were an ancient palace. He does say that whatever was atop the pillar was missing. So by this time, which is the 10th century, the statue seems to be missing. So if you combine that with the mosaics of 6th century, that would mean that that's, somewhere between the 6th and the 10th centuries, the statue atop the column disappears. Now, this is only a theory, and this is my theory, and maybe, some others share it. But other scholars have other ideas about this, cite other texts, etc. So this is just a theory. What happened? Was there an earthquake? Was this, statue somehow reused, replaced, etc. We don't know. Iconoclasm, none of this is known, but there are a lot of possibilities as to what, how the statue disappeared. Now we move on to other representations of Pompey's pillar without the statue. Now, in these cases, the pillar is often clearly labeled. And at this point, the lighthouse is gone, so it has become, the major, landmark. And we see it here in this 1472 European map. And these can be fanciful images. And in other words, not photographic. They add details that aren't present on the actual column. So in looking at these, you have to think about what information did the artist have. In other words, they very unlikely, they did not actually see it. So they were looking at other drawings or relying on someone's description, etc. That they're not eyewitnesses. And then the other side is, what did the viewer need to understand when they're looking at this map and trying to understand the things on it? What did they need to understand? So in this case, it is labeled Pompey's tomb, and this is find a little house on it, or it looks like a little house, and maybe this is a way to that artist or someone he copied from used to represent this urn, because some Roman cinerary urns, which for ashes, do have these kind of peaked tops. Now here's another one from the 1575 map. Now, in this case, you see that round urn on the top, and then it's got the spiral decoration, which is, again, not on the actual column. So this seems to refer to other columns like Trajan's, which do have that kind of spiral decoration on it. And then finally, that circular emblem on the bottom, unfortunately, it's not entirely clear. You can't see all, there's not a lot of detail in it, but it might be a Christian symbol, because it does look an awful like that Christian symbol, what is definitely a Christian symbol, and that kind of Marcion in Istanbul. So this would be another one of those evocations of the triumph of Christianity. Now, on this Ottoman Turkish map, what's fanciful is the scale. It is enormous. It is so much bigger than anything else around it. Again, to demonstrate that this is the landmark you're looking for when you're coming into the harbor for Alexandria. Now here we have this painting by the Bellinis. Here we have St. Mark that we were talking about before, who was the Christian saint who preached in Alexandria and was martyred there. Interestingly, this painting was commissioned by the Scuola di San Marco, like we were talking about earlier. And in the painting, it's quite a fanciful scene. We see Cleopatra's Needle, that's now in New York, and we also see Diocletian's column in the distance. Now that the column has this globular, fanciful shape on top of it, this seems to be like a imitation or evocation of that urn that we were looking before, that was by legend held the ashes of Julius Caesar, and that formerly sat atop the Vatican obelisk in Rome. So the Bellinis seem to be maybe playing with a kind of a similar idea for their rendition of what Pompey's urn, would look like. And then here we clearly have a Christian cross added, which is not on the pillar in Alexandria. So again, this theme of the triumph of Christianity. As a final fanciful image, here's the one from Paul Lucas, who's a French antiquarian, and he visits Egypt in the 18th century, and he created this drawing for a scientific purpose. So you see there's like this one stone sitting underneath the column. And he wasn't trying to show that there was only one stone under the column, when in fact there are many underneath it, as you see in that modern photograph. He was just trying to indicate that the real form of support for the pillar was this one major stone, and the other stones underneath were, not as critical to the support of the pillar as that one single stone. Now, this drawing was later subverted for political purposes when the French were debating whether to bring the monument to France as a monument for the French king. In other words, save this unstable monument. It's resting on this one stone. It's going to fall over, etc. Obviously, this didn't happen. It remains in Alexandria. So now we come to the story of the Porphyry statue. This is going to be a little scholarly. I'm going to liven it up with a couple of things. And then what I consider to be a modern legend. So what is? This is a present day viral story. Again, I would consider this a legend. And according to this story, there used to be this colossal porphyry stone statue of Diocletian that formerly sat on top of the pillar. There are countless references to this story in scholarly and popular literature that affirm it, that say this is true. There was a porphyry statue on top there. And like the Pompey Pillar story, there's a similar sort of trajectory. When it first comes into being, you get support from very powerful people. And then you also get not only the printing press, but now the internet, which then, really propagates the story. And in case you don't know, porphyry is this luxurious purple stone that was favored by the Roman emperors and was quarried in Egypt. So here's the story. Here are the principal actors. So we have the naturalist Cennini, we have the artist Casas, and the wealthy aristocrat Choiseul Gouffier. Act 1. So Cennini travels to Alexandria in 1777. Then he publishes his voyage in 1798. And in it, he talks about how he had met these friends of a certain Monsieur Wolfoli. And what these friends had told him was that they had found near the pillar these enormous pieces of, porphyry of this big statue that, later got thrown into the sea. And, he tried to see them, but, actually maybe really couldn't see them. But they did, tell him that these were actually porphyry. Act 2. So Casas, a few years later, visits Alexandria and he publishes his voyage in 1800. And part of his role there is to acquire antiquities for Choiseul Gouffier, who does not visit Egypt. And I'm going to repeat that. Choiseul Gouffier does not visit Egypt. And as part of his publication, Casas, most of his publication are these plates. He never publishes, unfortunately, most of his written account. So there are these plates, and they're in this map of Alexandria. He has a very convenient sort of X marks the spot where he writes place where a superb fragment of the statue of porphyry was removed. And you'll notice that that's on the shoreline. That's not a Pompey Pillar, which is quite a distance away. So Act 3. So the fragments join the collection of Choiseul Gouffier in France. He passes away. His collection is sold off. We have this 1818 catalog, which was written by Dubois, who's an associate of Choiseul Gouffier and a curator at the Louvre. And he writes in that catalog, porphyry and these fragments. And again, he says, they were from the shore of the sea. Like Casas, never mentioning the Pompey Pillar provenance. And then there's an epilogue. The porphyry fragments then move to other collections in France. The fragments disappear from the record and are apparently lost. So then this is the launching pad for this story that there used to be this porphyry statue on the pillar, and this takes off in the published record. So the basic problem with all of this is that there's no first-hand account of any of this. It's all at best secondhand. And as you can see in Cennini's statement, he just talked to some unnamed friends. Are these reliable people? Did he really understand? I mean, it's just a lot of uncertainty in that. And then Casas and Choiseul Gouffier don't even mention that whole story of these fragments coming from Pompey's Pillar. Now, people who know this story are going to say, but wait a minute, there are all these other accounts of how these fragments were found in the pillar. And indeed, here in this magisterial publication, this is a wonderful publication by Fraser on Alexandria, he writes a 4-page footnote that summarizes all of these other stories. Well, if you look at these, unfortunately, what you have are, again, more secondhand stories and worse, contradictory stories and misinformation, including the whopper statement in the description that Charles de Bouffier himself, and remember, he didn't travel to Egypt, he found the fragment at the foot of the pillar. So unless you want to somehow theorize that he secretly somehow had some futuristic teleportation device that allowed him to secretly travel back and forth to the pillar without anyone knowing about it, that story is just dead in the water. So all of these things, none of this helps establish anything about whether those fragments really, were found at the pillar. And in fact, I think should simply be binned. I did try to confirm this story in other ways, and to look at other accounts from visitors who may have visited the pillar. They don't say anything about this, nor do subsequent excavation reports. They don't talk, or they do not report finding an additional fragments of any such statue. And even if you could somehow prove that these fragments from the site, which does not, certainly is not in the evidence, you would also need to prove that they even came from the top of the pillar, which is a whole nother mountain to climb. So I think this is just another from Pompey's Pillar story. This is another one of these relic stories where people purported provenances to sort of take the power of these ancient monuments home with them. And in this case, rather than just some small fragment of granite, these are fragments of this luxurious porphyry fit for an aristocrat that made their way to France. So I think the story of the porphyry statue needs to join the other legends of Pompey's Pillar, from St. Catherine to knocking the statue off to being an observatory, Pompey's urn, the djinn made it, and magic. It belongs, that's where it belongs. So what about this statue? So what is far more likely, and had this porphyry statue story not been so pervasive, what we would probably be talking about is that it was a bronze statue. And the very basic reason for that is that bronze statue allows you to create really dynamic profiles from afar. So you can put your arms out, you can spread your legs, etc., without having significant sources of support. So whereas in stone statues like porphyry, you have to keep things close to the statue or have different supports that, and still would be very liable to break it. So you cannot get these sort of dynamic profiles in stone as you can get them in bronze. And in looking at, oh, and here's an example of, bronze statue, just to get an idea of what I'm talking about. And if you look at these mosaics, even if you don't believe that these are Diocletian's column, they nevertheless represent statues that are meant to be seen from a distance. And these all look like bronze statues. So they have these arms out, spread legs, etc. These are bronze statues. So I would think that what originally was there was a bronze statue atop the pillar. And with that, I'm going to end with this. Well, this summarizes things a lot better maybe than I could. So that's why I chose to take this quote from the Penny magazine that was published by the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge back in 1834. And it gives both the story part and the landmark part. So scarcely any one of the monuments of antiquity is involved in so much mystery and uncertainty, or has afforded so wide a field for conjecture and the speculations of the scientific as that known by the name of Pompey's Pillar. It is so intrusively visible as to be descried for miles around, and is one of the first objects discerned by ships making this part of the coast of Egypt, which everywhere is very low. And with that, I thank you, and I think we will have time for questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul. That was fascinating. And as we were talking before the lecture started, something slightly different than the pharaonic that we are usually doing in some of these afternoon weekend lectures. So thank you so much. For everyone on online, please put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat. And let's see if we have any questions. I know they are coming in. Let's see. It looks like there's some people. Just one moment. Okay. Do we have any questions in the audience? We have, we'll give a second. Hold on a second. Okay, there we go. It usually takes a second for them to start coming through. Okay, let's see. Do you think that the epithet pillar of masts could be that sailors in the port would have seen a pillar through a lot of the other masts?
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Sure. I mean, I love that. Why not? That's a great idea.
Okay, someone has made a good joke here. Is the pillar in good standing, or does it is it facing environmental or political threats right now?
I mean, it is pretty well preserved. There is wind damage on it. In other words, sand hitting it has eroded it a bit, but it's actually quite well preserved. I don't know of any other, I mean, there have been various attempts to kind of shore it up in different ways over time, and because it is a tourist attraction. I don't know of any other political sort of stuff surrounding it, more you know, modern, later than that one incident I was talking about.
Mm-hmm. And would you happen to know what would have been the source of the stone, which quarry?
I don't believe this has ever been officially tested, but the assumption is Aswan.
That makes sense. Do we know, Carol wants to know, do we know the date of the first actual photograph of the pillar?
Well, the earliest one I know is the one that I showed, that daguerreotype from 1842. I mean, maybe there's another one, but that's the earliest that I'm aware of.
Oh, this, all right, let's see. Lorelei would like your comments on her observation that the statue on top of the column in the mosaics looks like the Colossus of Rhodes. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that's an interesting thought. I mean, we only have descriptions of that Colossus too. And I guess, well, a couple of things. One is that maybe there are some things held in common by these statues meant to be seen from afar, that they would have similar sort of iconography and similar kinds of poses and things with them. So maybe that's why you might also be thinking of the Colossus and Rhodes. But it's also back to that whole thing of what did the artists really know, and like what were they really basing this on? Is it just they just knew about these massive statues, so they, you know, it's not a photograph, so they had some idea of what these statues needed to look like, but you know, weren't trying to necessarily capture them photographically. But thank you, Lorelei. That's an interesting observation.
And how tall is the pillar actually? I know you had some photographs in there, but do we know? Well, I know.
Well, I don't remember that. I think it was 29 meters on that slide, if I'm remembering correctly now. Yeah, because the other ones were like over 30. So this is a little bit of a problem, because there has not been a modern scientific examination. I rely on actually the French expedition, the Bonaparte, because they seem to have done the most accurate measuring. I don't know of a more recent attempt to do the measurement. And I think that for me, that's the best that there is. And that's where I got that 29 from. And that is from ground level to the top of the column, the column capital.
Let's see. Someone is saying, thinking of recent statues that have been pulled down from plinths recently due to BLM. Could hated statues be pulled down from the pillar at such a height? And if so, how?
Well, I hope you remember seeing those pictures of people going to the top of the column. So yes, people had, I mean, you could, well, the stories are that you could like fly a kite to then secure a stone up, or not stone, a rope up there that you could then get to the top and then, you know, do whatever you needed to do to topple it. The other way that, I don't know whether this really works or not, but the other way people said is you have a bow and arrow and you would shoot the arrow with a string or something over the top, and then you could pull the rope up that way. So, you know, these things have been toppled from even higher columns. So believe me, people had ways to get places if they really wanted to. They found.
Human
There's one story
ingenuity.
that a donkey actually was brought up there at one point. But anyway, go ahead.
No, say that again. I'm sorry, I was cut you off.
Well, there's also one story that somehow a donkey was brought up there, but that may be just a legend. Go ahead for
Let's
more
see.
questions.
Sure. If there was a bronze statue on top of the pillar, could the bronze be melted down and reused, similar to how stones were reused in churches and mosques?
Well, that is the reason that you would want to bring it down, because and that's unfortunately, well, unfortunately for us, maybe not unfortunately for whoever wanted to reuse it. That's why we mostly do not have any bronze statues from antiquity, because they were all taken down and remelted for reuse. And there is one, I didn't mention this, there is one story in Islamic sources about that some people think is the statue. I don't agree, but some people think is the statue from Pompey's Pillar, made of bronze, being brought down and remelted for use in coins. But I don't think that story refers to Diocletian's column.
Let's see. I'm going to combine a couple questions here. Could you say something about describe the site of where the pillar sits, and how difficult is archaeology? How difficult is it to access things around the site?
Oh boy. Great question. I'm not laughing. It's a really great question, but it's really, well, so it is today a modern tourist site. So it actually is quite accessible. If you're talking about today, it's quite accessible. The whole site around the pillar, and there are a huge amount of antiquities and sort of the ruins of the ancient site around it. But for archaeologists, the big problem with the site, and for what we want to know, there were excavations done that were, let's say, not up to current standards. So they didn't necessarily record all the things that we want to know, or didn't publish everything. So there are problems with some of the archaeology of the site. So we don't have the kind of record we would really like to know. And as I mentioned, this is not like, I don't know, the ruin of, you know, like the temples of Upper Egypt, where you have a lot of it preserved. This is really, a lot of it was really stripped down to the foundations, you know, a long time ago. And so when you're excavating, you get this jumble of stuff, and you're only getting foundations, a lot of broken things. So it's a very, archaeologically, it's a very difficult site to interpret. And, you know, when the archaeology was done, it wasn't really done to, you know, modern standards. And in fact, because of all of this, it wasn't until fairly recently that anyone even attempted a reconstruction, like those reconstructions I was showing. It was so difficult to understand the site that people didn't attempt. And those those most recent reconstructions, they may not even be like really correct, but they're kind of the best of what we have, given the evidence.
Thank you. Let's see. Carl would like to know, are there existing statues of Diocletian which might be compared with the image depicted in the early mosaic?
I don't know if, I mean, there are stone representations that are attributed to him, portrait heads, etc., and inscriptions. I don't think there are any bronzes. There are bronzes of maybe a comparable date or somewhere in that vicinity that would give you an idea of what they would have looked like at that point. I don't believe there are any. I'm not sure about that one, but I don't believe so for Diocletian himself. And usually when you have for bronze statues, you might have only a piece of it, like the head or the body or something, and often you really can't attribute it properly. So I don't believe there's one for Diocletian.
Okay. Denise would like to know, are there any other remains of this, is it Serape temple complex? And do we know about the date?
The Serapeum.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know if that was
so
a
that
type.
goes back to what I was saying before about the archaeology of the site. So in the excavation, they did find foundation plaques that did establish that the original Serapeum was earliest major Serapeum was created during the 3rd century BC. And then there was some rebuilding, maybe after a fire in the Roman period, but the date of that Roman one is disputed. And I also wonder whether, it's sort of assumed that Roman rebuild, some people say Hadrian, some people say, later than that. But there's no, I don't know of a concrete way to establish a date for the Roman rebuild. And I also wonder whether that Roman rebuild was sort of an all at once or whether it happened in pieces. We don't really know. Again, the archaeology of the site is very difficult.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of picking up on that. Someone says the Serapeum was built by Ptolemy III. Do you think he had the pillar built at that time, or could it have been brought there from somewhere else?
So it kind of relates to what I was just saying. So originally there was, well, this is the theory because the archaeology of the site is different. There was originally, as you say, a Ptolemaic Serapeum. And then maybe through fire or some other destruction event or a need to, or a desire to rebuild it, it was enlarged significantly. So that I believe that part where the pillar sits is actually not part of the Ptolemaic section, or maybe sits right on the edge of it or something. So that courtyard is actually larger than the Ptolemaic one, at least as far as we know. So, and then stylistically, and in terms of what has been found in that area, it is Roman. The style of the column is Roman, and it, there is discussion, as I said, about whether it is earlier than Diocletian, but still Roman.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. An interesting comment from someone. They said, I'm from Alexandria and support the theory of the pillar being made to be visible among a crowd of masts. Have heard that in conversation in the city a few times.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And let's see, where I lost it. Is it known who, they said, thank you for an amazing lecture. Is it known who arranged the cavity in the base of the sculpture?
Can you read that again?
It just says, so is it known who arranged the hole or cavity in the base of the sculpture?
So I'm not sure. So I'll give 2 answers to that. So if you're talking about the column capital, there is, and I didn't mention all this detail, there is a cavity.
Yeah.
People who've gone up there have said that there's a cavity on the top. I don't think that directly held the statue. I think
he said, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the thing in the base of the column. That's what I was thinking too, from the picture it looked that you showed.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just finish that. So I
Sorry.
think on top, there was some other crowning element that then supported the statue. The statue didn't directly sit on the column capital. There's something else that fit in the hole in the Capitol. But then underneath it, I didn't get into all that detail, but there's Veronica. So there are things that are from like the Middle Kingdom, the fragments of Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom, from other places in Egypt underneath. So presumably when this was, the foundations of this were originally being set up, this corresponds to this period of spolia, which is when ancient monuments, this is in the Roman Empire, ancient monuments were reused as building material. So in this case, they were reusing ancient Egyptian monuments to, as a support for the pillar. That foundation would not have been visible. That would have been, it is above ground level probably. In other words, in the ancient temple, it would have been above ground level, but it would have been surrounded by other stones that would have hidden all of that Veronica. That would not have been visible, or at least that's the theory. Wouldn't make sense that they were visible anyway, because some of them are like upside down and they're not done in such a way that you would, like, could read them or do anything with them.
Thank you. I think we have time for, we'll do like 2 more questions, and we have received some questions about notes for this lecture. The lecture will be posted online on the RC YouTube page. So if there was something you missed or you wanted to have a closer look at any of the slides, that will be up in about a week. So check back on RC on the RC YouTube page. And let's see. Someone says, was the statue of Poseidon on top of the pharaohs also bronze?
Yes. Well, again, that's the theory, and I don't remember whether, I mean, there are descriptions of these statues in some sources, which may mention that they were made of bronze, but that's definitely the theory, that these would have been bronze statues that would also have been gilded. In other words, that would be another way for them to even be more noticeable, that they would have been gilded so they would sparkle and you could really see them. They would glint, the sunlight would glint off of them.
All right. And our last question now, how do you think monuments involved in kind of mystery like these have impacted ideas for modern cities?
Modern
cities?
Well, I mean, that's not something I've thought about, but it's an interesting question. So just off the top of my head, I mean, all of these ancient monuments and people having the ideas about them over time have clearly affected how we continue to either construct or look at monuments. I mean, you saw that in the example of somebody making a copy of the pillar in 19th century Ireland, obviously building on that, ancient tradition. So I think we carry with us all these stories in one way or the other. So we inherit the things that people long ago thought out somehow in our memories, or the way we are as humans, that continue to affect and influence the way we might look at cities or the monuments we have in cities.
Yes. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Stanwyck, for this presentation today. And thank you to everyone in the comments and questions as well who expressed your gratitude to Dr. Stanwyck. We had so many people who really enjoyed this lecture. Lorelei says it's great to hear more about Ptolemaic and Roman monuments in the RC lectures.
Lorelei, but you're a Ptolemaic and Roman person, so but thank you for that.
Well,
okay. All right.
wonderful.
Thank you, Liska.
Yes, and to everyone in the audience, this, like we said, this will be up on the RC YouTube page shortly. We thank you again, Dr. Stanwyck, and all of you for being with us here today. And I hope that I will see many of you at the RC annual meeting in Minneapolis. So have a wonderful day, everyone. Take care.